Greetings, salutations, respect and love. I am Scott. You're in the Prog Corner, and today, man, we've been marketing this and publicizing this event for quite some time. It is the one and only Brian Coombes from Rocking Horse Music Club. Brian, thank you so much for finally making it in here into the Sunday Prog stream. How you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
No, it is an honor. And as we were saying right before we went on, I have been listening to this in preparation for this episode nonstop. It's such a good record. Circus of Wire Dolls. It's so ambitious. It's like an hour and it's like an hour and a half or something. That's a lot of music, man. Did you ever think for a minute that maybe I should compromise my principles and put this thing out as a single album?
It kept growing and growing as we got more in depth with the story. And there are half a dozen songs that didn't make the record.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah. I knew that was a dumb question, but I had to ask it because, a lot of people diss double albums and they think they're indulgent in this and they can be at times, but what is prog rock if not always, a little self-indulgent? And I find the restraint on that album just really fantastic. Kevin Carmody from Prog Radio actually had Circus of Wire Dolls as his #1 album of 2022. I love this thing. Thank you for sending it to me. I obviously went ahead and checked it out as soon as I saw it was at #1, because usually it's, in people's top 10s, at least it's artists I knew about or had heard about. Tell me, how is it possible that I had never heard of you guys before? Give me a little background on you and on the band and how you've kind of slid under people's radar for so long and what we're going to do to fix that.
Well, yeah, certainly it was flattering to find ourselves at #1. And that was some validation about the record that we had put out. It was ambitious.
Yeah.
And sprawling, 22 songs. As far as being under the radar, it's funny. I've always kind of been a bit of an outsider, and no matter what we've done, right? I'm sitting here in central New Hampshire, and I grew up in New Hampshire. My previous band was a pop prog band called Tristan Park. And we were popular here in New Hampshire, but we were always outsiders with the Boston music scene, right? But then we signed with the old Cyclops GFT label in England. And, they signed us on the strength that we had one song that was in 7/8. We never really considered ourselves a prog rock band. We were,
but hey, it's in 7/8, man.
But it just, that's what felt right? So yeah. We were kind of like a pop version of Rush. And, so then we signed the deal with Cyclops and we went to England and we felt a little bit at home there, but we were still outsiders because we were American, right?
Yeah.
So, and then after Tristan Park ran its course, I opened up Rocking Horse Studio and spent a good 10 years producing other people here and not really doing anything of my own. But I also developed a great network of session musicians because we do a lot of work with singer-songwriters.
Right.
So we tended to get some of the finest musicians in New England. And then slowly, I started writing songs again. And that led us to our first single, was kind of a gospel inspired song called Everywhere Is Home. Nice. And I played it for some of my connections in England. And the next thing I know was getting played on the BBC.
Okay.
But certainly not a progressive rock thing. It's a pretty song. But then through the course of doing sessions, and some of my old contacts from the 90s, I met Anthony Phillips, who was always one of my absolute favorite musicians from my favorite band growing up, Genesis. Yeah, that's the one. And, so we decided, Michael Clifford operates a venue in Sussex in England called Trading Boundaries, which is kind of a prog oasis in the southern part of England. And he and I got to talking about doing a show, and he asked me if I was in doing a tribute show to one of the solo projects in Genesis. And the two that immediately came to mind were Tony Banks and Anthony Phillips. And he practically jumped out of his seat when I mentioned Aunt Phillips, because, you know, the logical ones or the obvious ones would have been Phil, Mike, Tony, Peter. Steve obviously is still out there doing his own thing. So he loved the idea of us doing an Aunt Phillips tribute. And that led us, while we were learning the songs, we recorded them. That was our way of learning them, and we reinterpreted them. And if you're listening and you're a Genesis fan, one thing that I think is really interesting about this record, on our song, our version of the song, Which Way the Wind Blows, it features Noel McCalla, who sang the lead vocals on Mike Rutherford's Small Creeps Day.
Yeah.
And Steve Hackett plays lead guitar on it.
Yeah. Yeah. I've seen that. That is so cool. This is a really good CD, by the way.
Thank you.
If you like Anthony Phillips music, and who doesn't, but you are so right. I mean, he's kind of the forgotten member, you know, in the history of Genesis. You don't really think a whole lot about Anthony Phillips. He was not inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame with the rest of the boys in the band, even though he's a founding member and was on the first two foundational albums. Obviously, man, I'm a big fan. So I was psyched to hear this, and it didn't disappoint. I love the back of this. You know, so we're not just focusing on, you know, the one great album. We're focusing on a few of the great early Anthony Phillips tracks. Just a really, really cool record. Well, and I love that thing.
Yeah, that was that was kind of a labor of love for me. You know, back in high school, when we used to have to, you know, put book covers on, and we would use paper grocery bags as book covers. And then we would all like scribble our favorite bands, and whatever we were into would be on our book covers. And I used to write Ant is God on mine. And I think I was probably the only one in that high school in Southern New Hampshire who knew anything about Anthony Phillips, let alone was saying Ant is God. And I always found his role in the band was fascinating.
Yeah, and definitely. And forgotten for a lot of people.
So, you know, the first time I met Ant, he was playing guitar on a project that I was producing. And I actually went to England to record with him at his place. And from there, I met Dale Newman. Okay. And again, if you're a big Genesis nerd like me, you actually know who the Road Crew are.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And Dale was something a little bit more than that. Dale sang vocals on one of my all-time favorite Aunt Phillips song, a song called Bleak House, which is on his Sides record.
Yeah.
And then he kind of was the studio manager at the farm. So Dale and I started talking, and we ended up producing a record for Dale. And as part of that, we did some of that at Genesis's studio, The Farm, which was pretty cool for me because I had grown up hearing about the legendary farm.
Exactly.
And suddenly we were there, and it felt really comfortable. It felt very similar to our studio here. And it got to the point where FedEx was making deliveries, and we were just signing as if we were just working there. It was, kind of a cool experience.
Yeah.
And, met Tony Banks at the farm.
Yeah. And today we are honoring the great Tony Banks. I've been putting some of the comments from the Peanut Gallery up there, and it is fun. We are live, as you were forewarned, and we're gonna get some comments like Prague and stuff asking about did we hear about the new Steve Hackett record coming out? That looks very interesting. His first concept album since Voyage of the Acolyte. Sounds good to me. You've got Amanda Lehman on it. You've got Nick DiVirgilio playing drums on it. What's not to like? What's not to be excited about? People talk about Anthony Phillips might have been responsible for writing Musical Box. Well, we know that already, but
Well,
He
yeah,
just a
I've got an
genius.
interesting story about that. I mean, I've asked Ant, how he felt about that, and asked
Yeah,
him, how come he didn't get a credit on that.
yeah.
And Ant is the consummate gentleman. He's a professional. He's profound. He said to me, he said, Brian, he said, the guys that carried on with the band after me did so much more for me than me contributing my little bits
Hmm.
to the musical box. He
Wow.
said, without without them carrying on, you never would have heard of Aunt
Yeah,
Phillips,
that is a
and
fact. Yeah, that is
what a
true.
genuinely gracious thing to say.
Wow. What a great way to look at it, because there. Hey, he quit the band. He was not fired. It wasn't like there was bad blood between them. They've always been friends. They probably always will be friends. But to me, I would be a little part of me would be jealous and different. By all accounts, he is a gentleman. Anthony Phillips, just amazing. What a genius. But Tony Banks, man, I mean, we are talking about the genius of Tony Banks today. And, only Tony Banks and Michael Rutherford can claim to have been on every Genesis record. So, whose impact on Genesis's entire career is more impactful, Mike or Tony's? Take a pick. I picked Tony. I think his vision from start to finish really made Genesis what it was. And Anthony Phillips is a big part of that origin story. We talk about that, the 12-string guitar magic that started with Tony and Anthony. I mean, that was something they really perfected, the two of them playing, the 12 strings and whatnot. And here's a question I don't have an answer to. When did Tony Banks stop playing guitar live?
Yeah, that's a good question. I know he was still playing it through Trick of the Tail tour, Wind and Wuthering. So that might have been the end.
That might have been the end, yeah, because I saw him in
after
70.
Steve left.
My first was 78, and then there were three. There was no guitar in Tony Banks' hand on that tour, so I know it had to have been an earlier date. My people know, and they're going to let us know. They're very smart, very wise people. But here we have come to the self-glossing part of the program here, and what we have here before us is a strange anomaly, Brian. I don't know if you're looking at that, but yesterday we hit 6,666 subscribers. That's a little scary, man. That's a little spooky. Luckily we've blown past that. I'd be scared if we got stuck on that number. That'd probably tell me something. But here's the thing that I really wanted to look at, and it's just emblematic of the overall health of the Prog Corner. This is watch time for the past 365 days. If you see the growth of this channel, it's been exponential. It's been outstanding. And I just want to thank each and every one of you out there watching. It's because of you guys that the channel's growing. And I really appreciate all of you in the peanut gallery for making the Prog Corner what it is. Thank you so much. But Brian, I'm going to run through a little bit of the Genesis discography as we talk a little bit about their music and when you first heard about them. This thing here, when did you first encounter this? Me, obviously, it was after I became a super fan, and probably before, and then there were three, probably right about the time I got it. So, what were your first impressions of it? What does this one mean to you, if anything?
Well, again, I certainly wasn't there when it was first released.
Yeah.
But once I became a Genesis fan, I voraciously went through the entire discography.
Yeah, and you had to encounter this one. You had to come to terms with this one.
Yeah, absolutely. I enjoy that song, that album. I think it's a good pop record, and again, I know the Genesis guys say it's probably a good thing that it wasn't a hit, And I probably, I agree with that. It sounds like some pretty intelligent schoolboys writing some good pop tunes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's got some decent songs. It just sounds like they didn't really know who they were. They were taking some bad advice from their manager instead of listening to their own musical instincts. But, how old were they when they were laying down these tracks? They were still fairly young guys, and they weren't even sure music was going to be their thing, right? They were, boarding school kids at Charter House. And I think after this record, the band actually broke up for a minute. And it wasn't until after Tony Banks quit. I guess he went to University there for a minute.
Yep.
And wasn't until he quit and they decided this was going to be kind of a full-time venture. So, like a lot of bands, even today, you put out this vanity record, right? And it's just a shot in the dark. You don't know if anybody's going to like it or not. One thing they really had going for them was a fantastic name. I mean, there was a lot of slack in the rope back in 1969. There were a lot of good names still up for grabs, and man, they got a good one. That's one thing Jonathan King absolutely did for them. Nailed that great, snappy, catchy one-word name that gives off all the biblical imagery you could ever hope for that would come in handy later on. And then we get this one, man, the one that really starts it all. You got the great Paul Whitehead album cover, just fantastic. Just such what a difference an album makes. I don't know of any band that made a bigger jump from their first to their second albums in music history than this one, because this one's pretty close to perfect. They almost got it perfect on this one. What are your thoughts on Trespass, Brian?
Yeah, agreed. Again, going backwards through the discography, I remember reading the liner notes of Trespass and seeing different names. Wait, how come this Phil Collins guy isn't here, right? Yeah. But I quickly and thoroughly fell in love with Trespass. I know Ant considers that the first real Genesis record.
Yeah.
And another name who I know Genesis fans know, and he's another friend of mine, is Richard McPhail.
Oh yeah.
And I think he deserves an awful lot of credit for motivating the band to stay together. A lot of that record was recorded at the cottage that Richard's family owned.
And legendary cottage, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I think without his support, Genesis might not have survived past Trespass. They might not have, survived Ant's departure. So Richard is, an unsung hero in the Genesis history.
Absolutely. And Trespass, an unsung record in their history. If this record hadn't have been as good as it was, you probably wouldn't have been able to get the talent that they needed when they needed it, because obviously after Trespass, Anthony Phillips is he's just not feeling it, man. It's a lot of pressure to be in a rock band, and all of a sudden you're on a label and there's expectations, and I don't think he was enjoying the live gigs at all. Did he have like some kind of stage fright or something like that, Brian?
Yeah, he had stage fright, and he and I have talked about this quite a bit. He had something called glandular fever, which we in America would call mononucleosis.
Ooh.
And just for me personally, something similar happened with Ant. I was an athlete growing up and going to school. I was a big basketball player and I was a good baseball player. And halfway through my high school baseball career, I suddenly lost my nerve and was terrified of being hit by a pitched ball as a hitter. That had never happened to me before.
Right.
The winter before baseball season, I had mononucleosis. So I didn't think anything of that until Ant had told me that he had done some reading that mononucleosis can kind of cause these fears. And he and I wondered if the same thing that caused me to lose my lose to suddenly become terrified of baseball was the same thing that caused him to be terrified to go on stage.
Yeah, interesting.
Because prior to that, Ant was the one who was encouraging them to go out and play. And he was the one who was energetic and, looked good on stage with the red Stratocaster. And
he was kind of, in a way, he was kind of the driving force of the band. He was never the leader per se, but there were a lot of worries inside Genesis camp after Anthony Phillips left that maybe they didn't have enough to keep going. I mean, he was that important to the band. And so they needed to recruit a couple new members, man. What a daunting and terrifying prospect that had to be. But my goodness, they did pick up a couple decent ones, right?
Well, yeah. And shout out to John Mayhew, who's the drummer on Trespass, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I know Richard and Ant have both told me that he was a fine drummer. And history has not been kind to him because of who replaced him in the band, right? I mean, a once in a generational talent like Phil Collins steps in, that's going to make anybody pale in comparison.
And to that end, Anthony Phillips suffered a little bit of that as well. And he more than holds his own in the annals of history. But man, Steve Hackett and Phil Collins show up and they just change everything, man. The whole arithmetic for the band changes. The whole chemistry within the band changes. You just now have this weird alchemy. This is 1971 here, people. And Tony Banks has found some really cool, haunting sounds on that Mellotron now. And this record, people dog it all the time for its production. I think it's really only the drum sound that's not great. I think the rest of it sounds fine, actually, and kind of gives it its charm. But Nursery Cryme is a perfect album. It's 10 out of 10. Tony Banks is a big part of why it is. His 12-string guitar playing opens the album, man. I mean, it's a real forgotten part of his talent is not just his keyboard playing, his songwriting, his lyricism, but his guitar playing also. And it's in evidence here, Musical Box. I just love this album. Nursery Cryme, what's it mean to you in Genesis's discography, Brian?
So I had that one on cassette.
Yeah.
It was in that kind of weird transition going from vinyl to cassette to CD. I think I got that one for Christmas one year. And apart from all of the wonderful proggy songs, I was also fascinated by For Absent Friends with Phil Collins singing. And what a gorgeous little song that is.
Yeah, I love it.
Again, the two new guys kind of making their appearances felt, but yes, I mean, to me, it's about the big Mellotron chords of Tony Banks.
Oh yeah,
that sells the record for me.
Yeah, it's just a gorgeous record. It's Tony Banks really figuring out what this instrument could do. And I think a lot of people prefer like Selling England by the Pound and records like that because they maybe had a bit more variety of keyboard sounds and keyboard textures. But man, when you have mastered the Mellotron wash as perfectly as Tony did in 1971, I don't know if I want to hear all those other sounds or not. I love the ARP Pro. I mean, it's a beautiful instrument,
right?
But man, oh man, give me that Mellotron and the Hammond, and it's just a beautiful record. Zeb's giving it a 7 out of 9. Sean Welsh was asking what the music press in the UK thought at the time about Anthony Phillips leaving the band. It was a collective yawn. Nobody cared. Trespass didn't move the needle either. Certainly a little more than the first one did, but nobody cared. And again, yeah, a shout out to Paul Whitehead for this. Yeah, I'm a big fan. Yeah. And also did the cover for Leor. We did a couple album covers we love. She also gives it a 9 out of 10. And the Mellotron was it, man. Just absolutely perfect. I love it on here. And that's what we need more in modern prog. We need more Mellotron in everything, man. Remember 1973, Brian? Aerosmith had a little song called Dream On. It had Mellotron all over it, right?
Yep. Aerosmith, they're from right up the street from me.
I mean,
in New Hampshire.
Now, used a Mellotron in 73. So, yeah, the world needs more Mellotrons. Absolutely.
So I tell you what, Scott, two things. If you want more Mellotron in modern prog, listen to Circus of Wire Dolls. And I probably should have, if I had known I guess I should have known we were going to talk Mellotrons. I could have had my Mellotron sitting right here because I have a Mellotron 400 in the studio. You can see the little area up there that's going into the big part of the studio, and we have a Mellotron that appears all over Circus of Wire.
Well, I'm not going to argue with your backdrop. I think the people in the peanut gallery would absolutely agree. That's cool, having the mixing board, got the monitor with the screensaver, looking like you're the captain of the Starship Enterprise or something going on here. It's awesome. I love it. Some of us, we would have seen that Mellotron and just absolutely gone crazy. But, aesthetically, I think you made the right choice. Kevin is giving... I think he's given Nursery Cryme a 9 out of 10. Not our show today. I'm pretty sure he would give us a 10 out of 10. 10 out of 10 compared to all
okay, good. All right.
That's a cop-out, Kevin, and you know it. But, when you find the absolute perfect lineup, which I'm sorry, you could make a case that Peter Gabriel, Tony Banks, Steve Hackett, Mike Rutherford, Phil Collins, the most perfect 5-piece band you could ever assemble. And I make that case on a regular basis. You put out this thing right after Nursery Cryme. How do they get better than Nursery Cryme? Well, they come up with arguably the greatest piece of music ever written for side 2. That's how they did it. I could make a case that overall maybe I like Nursery Cryme maybe a little bit better, but Supper's Ready, man. That's all. I always just go back to that. Some of the most perfect music I've ever heard in my life. This album changed my life when I heard it. It absolutely did. Watcher of the Skies, just adore it. But yeah, it starts and ends with how you feel about the epic, and I love it. So Foxtrot, what's it mean to you, Brian?
Well, a couple of things. I mean, first of all, I think it suffers a little from a production side because I think they changed producers a couple of times in the making of that record.
They did.
So I think it's a little bit murkier than Nursery Cryme. I think the band is stronger. And you were just showing the inside. There's my friend Richard McPhail with a top hat. And the picture of Richard in there is, I enjoy that.
Your man on that.
Yeah, there he is. The man with the top hat, which I believe was at somebody's wedding when that picture was taken, from what I remember him telling me. But yeah, no, Foxtrot, it was huge for me. Supper's Ready was a revelation for me. Timetable is also a favorite. I know that's a Tony Banks song.
Oh yeah.
Again, proving that Tony could even then write a melodic tune. But again, Watcher of the Skies. I mean, that was the first thing I played when I got our Mellotron.
Didn't the company actually come up with a Watcher's patch for future models of the Mellotron? Actually had the Tony Banks sound that he used on Watchers. So you didn't have to flip multiple switches to get that sound. You could just flip one switch and you got the Watchers sound. That tells you something right there, just how iconic this record is and Tony Banks' sound. I'm not really detecting a lot of new sounds or technologies between Nursery Cryme and Foxtrot. What I do detect, like you said, is a little unevenness. They did change horses in the middle of the race with a new producer that came in and cleaned it up. Just imagine what it would have sounded like had he not come in and did that. What was that? John Anthony, I guess, came in
Well,
at the last minute.
yeah, no, I think it was Dave Hitchcock, right?
No,
'Cause I think
John Anthony might have started it, and then
yeah, he started it.
Hitchcock came
Yeah,
in and finished
yeah, yeah.
something
And
like
you know,
that. Yeah.
I know as a record producer, you know, when you're dropped into the middle of a project, it's kind of like
Yeah.
trying to finish somebody else's painting, right? And you want to be respectful from what had come before, and you don't want to have to reinvent the wheel. And I know that Genesis didn't have an unlimited budget. They weren't the Beatles. They couldn't camp out at Abbey Road for months and months because they had to go out and play gigs. So I'm sure if Dave Hitchcock had had his way, they would have scrapped everything and started again.
Oh, some very good news, boys and girls. I've been harping for years about one of my favorite bands of all time, Ritual. Great Swedish band featuring Patrick Lundstrom from Kaipa. None of their records are on vinyl, including the Great Hamulic Voluntary Band, one of my favorite albums of all time, which I forgot to put on my best of 2009 list because I'm an idiot. But they just got signed to Charisma, and I'm really excited about that. That's the power we got here in the Prog Corner, Brian. We get bands signed, and yeah, I'm taking credit for that one too. I'm excited about it. Finally, we're going to get some vinyl from Ritual, and that's just been bugging me so much. Vinny wants to know who's this Tony Banks guy. Yeah, you know, I don't know if Vinny's being serious half the time, but he's a good dude and we love him. And, you know, I actually came into Genesis with a live album, and then I got this one next. What is this, man? It's Foxtrot, Nursery Cryme together. The first thing I ever got was that live album from '73. And yeah, I just think this is great. It's the best of Genesis. And it's those two albums, and honestly, it's hard to argue that might be the best thing they ever did. Just a cool novelty. Did you ever see that one lying around?
I had not seen that. No.
It's a great little relic that Buddha put out after the fact, I guess, once Genesis started getting a little name for themselves. But you know, next up in the marching orders, you know, it's this one here where the band really started expanding their sound, expanding their palette, and a lot of that is what Tony Banks had brought to this album. A lot of new sounds, a lot of new keyboards, and a lot of different approaches, and a lot of piano. I mean, you didn't hear a lot of piano in Nursery Cryme or Foxtrot. So this record is really a revelation for the band and for Tony. A lot of people's favorite Genesis album right here. How do you feel about that? Do you concur? Is this their finest moment, Brian?
It is definitely my favorite Genesis record from the Peter Gabriel era. I'll say that. I think it was their biggest leap forward musically. I think from a production standpoint, it was the best to date. And then, like you say, the Art Pro Soloist was a new paintbrush and
Game
Tony
changer, man.
palette, you know, and that gave him the ability to play quickly, because you can't really play quickly with a certainly, I can tell you folks, it's hard to play fast when you're playing a mellotron.
Can't do it.
And even, you know, Hammond organ can sometimes be sticky, but
Mm-hmm.
you know, the light keys of the Art Pro Soloist, it's all over that record. I think it's a beautiful record. Firth of Fifth with the piano introduction. I think I probably played that one, you know, to my mom and dad, who were maybe worried that I was, you know, my earlier influences, you know, along with Genesis, I think kind of scared them. I was into the Doors because I fancied myself as a poet, and I thought turns out Jim Morrison was full of poo.
Right.
But, you know, when you're an 11, 12-year-old kid, I thought it was the coolest thing. So I was listening to the Doors, and I was listening to Piper at the Gates of Dawn, and the album that followed, Selling England, from Genesis. And I think my parents thought I was going down a dark path. So I played my mom. I remember this. I played the piano introduction to Firth the Fifth and
Firth
said,
the
"No,
Fifth for
look,
her.
these are real musicians."
Yeah.
And I think I probably also played After the Ordeal to show them, here's nylon guitar, and that it wasn't all big and bombast.
Zeb has an interesting comment here. He's saying the only slight problem he has with Selling England is After the Ordeal could have been so much better. Listen to the rock version they demoed. I haven't heard the demos from Selling England by the Pound. I'm going to admit, I don't know what the heck he's talking about here. Brian, do you know what he's talking about?
I do not.
I've listened to a lot of Genesis demos, but I don't think I've ever heard any of the Selling England demos for some reason.
No, I haven't heard that either. I do know that, Tony Banks has said on numerous occasions that he wasn't a fan of After the Ordeal.
Yeah.
I don't know if, I don't think he was happy with the song, but I also don't think he was happy with his performances on the song.
Yeah. And of course, the most common complaint about Selling England by the Pound is More Fool Me. A lot of people don't like it. I love it. I think it needs to be there. And if you look at the story arc, the career arc of Genesis as a whole, man, how important is that song in retrospect? It just set the table. You knew you had the future of the band already in the band, but they didn't know it, because I love More Fool Me. I think it's amazing. I still get, little goosebumps listening to it. I think he nailed it. And you can see that this guy was destined for greatness.
Sure.
Away from the drum set,
Sure.
Which was, for me, the first time I knew that, because For Absent Friends was just, he wasn't really singing that well back then. He had gotten a lot better here. I love this album. It's not my favorite Genesis album. My favorite Genesis album is the next one we're going to talk about, man. And I just absolutely 100% adore The Lamb is just such an ambitious mess. It's all over the place. The story on the inside is completely unreadable. The actual story of this is just ridiculous. I mean, some doctor comes along and cuts his thingy off, and a bird comes out of the sky, comes down, flies away with it, and he's following. Come on, man, it's ridiculous. But who cares when the music's this good? People say that the second, side of this, sides 3 and 4, aren't as strong as sides 1 and 2. They are different. I mean, I give people credit for hearing a discernible difference between disc 1 and disc 2. They're not wrong. They were rushed on disc 2. Atlantic wanted this thing out, and they wanted it out yesterday. They were rushed. And as a result, you get a really cool sound that they never, ever had again. It was almost like like a real instantaneous Genesis, almost like a punk Genesis.
Yeah.
It fit the story of the Puerto Rican street tough on the, streets of New York City. I think it's the second greatest album of all time.
Well, it showed even then that Genesis weren't afraid of reinventing themselves, right? Because they could have stayed in airy fairyland, that Selling England and Foxtrot, and talking about Greek and Roman myths.
Yeah.
And, what did they follow all that up with? A double album set in New York with a Puerto Rican street kid, right? I mean, that's brave, and for a bunch of English, public school boys to take that leap, that's brave.
Yeah.
And like you say, I think the production reflects the material. It's grittier, it's punkier, it's more visceral, right?
Yeah.
If as pretty as Selling England was from the album, and you can even tell from the album cover, Selling England is a beautiful looking album, and it's a beautiful sounding, polished album. And then you get to The Lamb, and it is not polished. It's gritty, it's raw, and that's what makes it powerful.
I think what really sets The Lamb apart from maybe my favorite album of all time, which is Tales from Topographic Oceans, is that you got complete and total buy-in from Tony on this. This thing could have gone off the rails real fast because this was a Peter Gabriel ego trip. He's talking to Hollywood directors, man, and he's going to be all this, that, the other thing. He's getting real big for his britches. Plus, he's got a kid, and the other boys in the band are like, I don't understand this. Something's coming before the band. You're out of your mind, dude. They didn't get it. They didn't understand, but yet somehow, some way, Peter got complete and total buy-in from Tony Banks, his bandmate from the Garden Wall days. They go back way before there was a Genesis, even before Anthony Phillips and Michael Rutherford were in the band, because they were in their own band in the Charter House called Anon or something like that.
Yes.
So this was almost like Tony saying, I'm gonna give it to you this one album, dude. I'm not happy about it, but I love you so much, and I feel you, that I'm gonna let you get away with it one time. And man, I'm so glad Tony did, because some of his best work of all time is on this thing. His keyboard patch choices are so beautiful, so diverse, so weird, taking you to all these different places. And a lot of that's Tony, because Steve Hackett's really buried in the mix most of the time on this thing. So It's all about what Tony Banks brought to this record. Just the perfect marriage of Peter's insanity and Tony Banks' absolute mastery. This thing could have been an absolute disaster, and it would have been without Tony Banks. He was the glue that tied everything together. Peter was like, I need a 3-minute instrumental section because I got to change out of this ridiculous costume. Give Tony and Mike a few minutes. They're going to come up with something magical. That's just how great they were in 1973, 1974. It's a masterpiece. I love it. I understand when people have their little gripes about it. They couldn't be more wrong. But to me, this is like a peak Genesis. Obviously, the last one with Peter. He had to go, man. There was nowhere. This is where maybe I disagree with Bill Bruford leaving Yes after Close to the Edge. Maybe there was a little more gas in that tank. There was nothing left after this. Peter had to go. There were going to be clashes beyond belief in the band if he would have stayed. So why not just go out with one of the greatest things in the history of mankind? And the music press, at this point, they were apoplectic when the news finally got out that Peter was leaving. The band was doomed. There was no possible way. How do you replace Peter Gabriel in a band that's as tightly knit as Genesis? Is a weird band, right? They weren't like Yes, where you got the feeling it was just a bunch of hired guns and, they didn't really care much for each other outside of the band. Genesis was different. It was very cliquey, very tight knit. So you just promote the drummer, man. And, I guess they had a bunch of auditions, but, who are you going to get? Phil Collins was the right guy for the job from the get-go. And, he's singing a little bit like Peter Gabriel on this album. I know when I play Genesis in the car, my wife always knows if it's Peter Gabriel or Phil Collins singing. Always, always, always. Until I put this one on, and she's like, I'm not really sure whether that's Phil or Pete. And I get it. I know what she's saying there. Phantom Limb Syndrome, Phil singing a lot like Peter, and Why Not? These songs were, in the process while Peter was still nominally in the band. But I love this thing. I don't think they missed a beat, really. I don't. This is every bit as good as anything they ever did. It's just a question of, what personal preferences are. This is a 10 out of 10. It's an absolute masterpiece. Brian, Trick of the Tail, man. What does this one mean to you?
Well, you're coming into my golden period. I keep going back and forth between Trick of the Tail and the album that followed it as my personal favorite Genesis records. I think they're just magical. And again, they went back to more of the poetry and the romance and the fantasy. So it was somewhat of a return, at least lyrically and sonically. The Mellotron makes a much bigger appearance on A Trick of the Tail. Mellotron was a little bit buried on The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. So Yeah, I mean, talk about, coming through with the goods. A Trick of the Tail. I mean, Madman Moon. I love that song. It's a beautiful Tony Banks song. Phil, I think that's one of his better vocals on the record. His vocal harmonies on that are really pretty. But I mean, how can you go wrong with Entangled and Dance on a Volcano? What a wonderful way to announce their presence with authority. Like,
Yeah.
hold on, Genesis isn't done yet. Listen to this, and like I say, Entangled is beautiful, Ripples is beautiful. It's that record is a masterpiece for me, and I love the cover art.
Yeah, and Zeb is talking about robbery, assault, and battery. Maybe brings it down a notch. I completely disagree. This is the same crowd that talks about Battle of Epping Forest, selling England by the pound. Poppycock, I say. The rhythmic section in that, the instrumental part of robbery, assault, and battery, before it gets to, he's leaving by the roof. Right before that rhythm, that Phil is laying down, man. What is that? I mean, it's just insanity. And how many bands have copied it? I've heard at least 3 or 4 different bands using that identical rhythmic pattern, and it's just pure genius. Why wouldn't you steal it? It's amazing. Yeah, man, I love every single thing about this record. It's 10 out of 10. I wouldn't change a single note. I love Squonk. I love how it starts, Dance on a Volcano, and then I love how it ends with Los Endos. And not only do they bring the Squonk thing back, but Phil is reciting a little line from Supper's Ready to Take You Home. Yeah, it's perfection, man. Forget about it. Anybody that says otherwise needs that earwax cleaned out of their ears. And then, I don't like that ring light. I didn't like my face with it, but look at all those rings behind me. Turn that off, whatever. Not just one great album in 1976. I mean, they went ahead and did it. Although the tour with, Bill Bruford for Trick of the Tail might have just been an amazing thing to behold. I wish I would have seen that, but they put this thing out and they tour it with Chester Thompson, which might have been actually a better fit for Genesis, as much as I love the mighty Bill Bruford. But this record here, man, 4-man Genesis. I wish it was more than 2 albums, man, because you look at 4-man Genesis and what do you got? You got Trick of the Tail and Wind and Wuthering, like yin and yang, right? They kind of sound real similar, but at the same time, they sound totally different. And again, it's Tony Banks and some of the keyboard choices he's bringing to bear here. Got the same producer, but it's got a different feel to it, man. It's kind of like the album cover, right? If ever an album cover kind of gave you an inkling of how you're going to feel listening to the record, icy cold, man. I mean, just with that autumnal chills in the air, and yeah, man, Wind and Wuthering.
Got my copy right here.
I just love it. What makes this album so special for you?
Yeah, boy, you just nailed it. The autumnal feel, the album cover. This was actually the second Genesis record that I purchased. So the first one, as I was going back to explore to their catalog, and it just hit me like a ton of bricks. I love this record so much. It just sounds so beautiful. 11th Earl of Mar gets it off to such a wonderful start. One for the Vine. It's poetic and romantic and so Tony Banks.
And I do not want to hear anybody tell me that Inside Out needs to be on Wind and Wuthering. You know why? Because then we wouldn't have the greatness of Spot the Pigeon. How cool is this 3-song EP? I mean, it fits right in the Wind and Wuthering time period. All 3 songs are awesome. But I love the sequencing of Wind and Wuthering. I wouldn't change it. I get what people are saying. What maybe your own special way. or Watt Gorilla. I guess people have maybe a little bit of a problem there. But
Well, I think Steve had a problem with What Gorilla.
Yeah, did he?
Yeah, but I mean, they were restricted by the space that they had on vinyl.
Yeah.
The comment about "It's Yourself," yeah, "It's Yourself" would have been great on A Trick of the Tail.
Yeah.
But it is what it is. I mean, if those records had come out with a different technology in the CD era, those songs probably would have been on the record, and we would have loved them. I don't have a problem with What Gorilla because, again, I saw that comment about Brand X.
Exactly. Yeah. This album here, to me, 11th Earl Lamar, to me, told me right away they weren't done. There's plenty of gas in the tank. And then by the time you get to the way this album ends with unquiet slumbers for the sleepers in that quiet earth leading into Afterglow, come on, man. That's as good as Supper's Ready, people. That's as good as Fifth of Firth. That's as good as Cinema Show. That piece of music right there, how it just seamlessly goes from one idea to another and just climaxing with the beautiful Afterglow. Such an amazing, amazing piece of work. And that would be the end of our beloved Steve Hackett in the band. And, a great and tragic loss. Yeah, we all know that. But, the boys weren't dead. There was still going to be some records. And when this one came out, this is when I finally got to see the band. It's 1978, Brian. Picture this, man. I'm living on a sailboat. So not only is there no internet, but I have zero access to like music magazines or any information about the outside world. But I knew we were going to be flying into Milwaukee. My dad had some work, so I was going to go up to him. Got some tickets to see Genesis. I'm all excited. And who's that guy playing guitar? Who's that? I had no idea that Steve Hackett had left the band. I hadn't heard this yet, so I was in for a big surprise. I wasn't so sure. I really didn't like this album for a long, long time as a result of those emotions. You have feelings about a band and certain members need to be there. It's like the No John, No Yes people over there in Yes Camp. I get it. I completely understand. But over the years, I have gained a huge amount of appreciation for this album. These are some really good songs. They were just presented in a shorter, snappier fashion. It was 1978. What do you expect? Sidelong epics weren't going to be in favor over there at Atlantic Records headquarters. Ahmet Ertegun was not going to, allow that to happen. They wanted hits. They got a hit. They got their first U.S. hit. Yeah, they had a UK hit with I Know What You Like, but that didn't chart here. Follow You, Follow Me did pretty good, man. I remember that getting a lot of airplay. And I remember thinking at the time, man, Genesis are going to be huge. And they absolutely were. I hated it, but I've come around. What are your thoughts on it? And then there were three.
For years, it was my least favorite Genesis record. I don't think I'm alone there. But again, as I grew as a musician, Down and Out, and that 5/4 groove is pretty badass.
They had to stop playing it live. It was so hard to play.
Yeah.
Chester couldn't do it.
It's pretty badass. It's pretty heavy.
Chester couldn't get it. Think about that. Chester Thompson couldn't play it right. Yeah. That's a bad groove, man.
I think Many Too Many, again, and a beautiful Tony Banks song in C sharp minor, which when I learned that on piano, C sharp minor has become one of my favorite keys. And every time I sit at a piano and play something in C sharp minor, I think Many Too Many.
Nice. Well, guitar players for years have been in love with C sharp minor because of its relative major. Every guitar player loves E, so C sharp minor has always been a favorite of guitar players, and it has a very special sound to it, doesn't it? Nothing else sounds like it.
Yeah, it sure does. And then I do, like you, my sister is a few years older than me, and she was into the current pop music of the day. And do you remember they used to put out compilation records of hits of
Oh yeah.
1978, right?
Oh yeah.
I remember listening to that with my sister and being offended by how atrocious everything was. But the last song on side 2 was Follow You, Follow Me.
And there you
And
go.
like you, I remember thinking Genesis isn't over,
Yeah.
and it's only going to get bigger from here.
Yeah, very grudgingly, I took to this album. That concert experience was just absolute one of the low lights of my life, and I wish I could go back and have a time machine and appreciate that show. Because I mean, come on, man! I look at the set list now, I'm like, there was just nothing but great tunes they were playing that night, but I wasn't in the right headspace for it. And to be 100% honest, I don't think I was quite in the right headspace for this when it came out either. It again took me a little while to figure out where Genesis was going, because again, we got some new sounds here. We didn't even talk about the new keyboard sounds Tony was employing on, and then there were 3. Isn't that the first appearance of that Yamaha piano?
Yep, the CP70.
Yeah, that kind of came to dominate the Genesis sound thereafter. It's all over this one, man. And you add to it drum machines, like Lynn programmed drums. And I'm like, hey, man, it must be the 80s. We're here. We've arrived. And, instead of limping into the decade with their tail between the legs, Genesis had kind of figured out a format, a plan. And even though they kind of went away from the prog after this, what was left in its wake was definitely a diagram for success. I love Duke. I wish the Duke suite had been somehow, collated and made into a long epic, because that's just the prog heart inside of me. But I understand why they didn't do it like that. It was probably a really good decision. This album has stood the test of time. It's real weird and trebly. You got a real weird EQ on here, courtesy what they were doing over there in ABBA's studios up there in Sweden. Got a strange sound, but I know a lot of people who think this is some of the greatest production work ever, just because the stacks and layers of Tony Banks keyboards. That this thing here is just epic. It's a monster, and I love it. Yeah. How did this come into your life?
Well, this is probably my favorite Genesis record from the Phil Collins trio group. And this is where maybe this is because this is where I got on the Genesis train in real time. So this was my first record. And if I can, I'll tell you a real quick story. In school.
It's your show, Brian. You can say whatever you want, man. You are our guest of honor on the Prog Corner. In case you don't know, Brian Coombes from Rocking Horse Music Club joining us here talking about Genesis and Tony Banks. So, yeah.
So, at school, there was a classmate of mine by the name of Tony Dion. And he was bragging one day at school about how his older brother was in a band called Genesis. So I must have been in the 7th grade. So what's that, 10 or 11 years old? So I pestered my mother to take me to, I don't know if it was Bradley's, but it was some department store with a music section. And I brought this record home, brought Duke home, and opened it up and saw Phil, Mike, and Tony, and said, wait a minute, I don't see anybody named Dion. So I went into school the next day and confronted Tony, and he was a big kid. I think he was shaving in like the 6th or 7th grade. Good guy and a good friend of mine. We played sports and stuff together. So I said, hey, Tony, I got this record yesterday, and
yeah, I'm looking through it.
Did you lie to me? Your brother isn't in this band. And he said, Brian, I told you that my brother was in a band called Genocide. Not Genesis, hey, Genocide.
Close.
That, my friends, is how I became a Genesis fan.
And how you saved yourself from getting your butt kicked, too.
Yeah,
Because you didn't want to go and accusing him. You, sir, were lying to me. And wouldn't you know it, that Genesis, they got huge after this point. Genocide, not so much.
that's right. Now, you mentioned the CP70. I have a CP70 again in that room. I should have just
Yeah.
brought it all in here. Basically, if Tony was using it, I eventually acquired one. So I have a CP70 and the Mellotron and the Hammond and the Taurus bass pedals are right here at my feet. But I love this record. I love the sound of the CP70. I think this was pre-Lindrum machine. I think this was the Roland.
Yeah, probably Roland. You're probably right. Probably Roland on it.
And
But it sounded weird to my ears, man. I was not expecting this on a Genesis record. So it definitely caught my ears, and I was like, okay, Genesis is certainly changing. You're not going to get Supper's Ready Part 2 on any subsequent Genesis record. The 3-man Genesis was a reality. It was here to stay, and we got a couple hits off of Duke. So you could see the handwriting on the wall, but honestly, for Genesis to go to that next level, it kind of took Phil Collins' solo career to go to the next level. He puts out Face Value, and that thing explodes. That sets the table for what came next. Phil Collins is a big old superstar now. This is the first Genesis album that was produced under those realities. It changes the band dynamic a little bit. Tony and Mike are kind of having to make a little bit of room for this one-time outsider. He can't be ignored anymore, can he?
Yeah, no, this was, but I think they were also bringing a bit more balance to the band, right? I think on Abacab, I think all the tunes were written by the band, but then they each had one solo tune, right? And, it's interesting that Man on the Corner sounds very Phil Collins. Me and Sarah Jane is a, beautiful Tony song. And, Like It or Not is a pretty nice. It also showed the romantic pop sensibility of Mike Rutherford, right?
Yeah.
When you think about of the three of them, and I know Phil gets knocked for being the pop guy, but if you talk to them, all three of them,
that's not fair.
Yeah, they were all pop fans. And, in particular, when Tony was trying, and I know we'll get to it in a couple of records, some of those tunes that are knocked as pop, if you listen to the harmonic progressions, there's nothing pop about them, and, Tony would say he was coming from a Burt Bacharach standpoint. And if you've ever tried to play a Burt Bacharach song, there's some pretty complicated harmonic stuff going on there.
Very colorful chord progressions and whatnot.
And
Kevin's got a point here about In the Air Tonight, which was, kind of in this, time frame. So we're going to take a minute and analyze this comment. Is it true? Did Phil bring In the Air Tonight to Mike and Tony? And if so, did they turn it down unceremoniously? Well, I have heard both sides of the story. And it's a little self-serving that Tony would say, no, I never heard that before. He never brought that to me. Why would you want to admit, that you made a big mistake? Like Eddie Murphy was never handed the script to Ghost either, which he was. You don't admit that kind of stuff. Obviously, Phil played the song for them. They turned it down. It was the right decision, man, right? I mean, the song is ginormous. It probably wouldn't have been that big if it were a Genesis song. Don't know why. That's just the way the universe works sometimes. In my world, in my little progosphere on Twitter and whatever, this one here gets hated on so much, man. I mean, just brutal hatred for Abacab, which I honestly don't understand. I think side one is brilliant. I love it. I played the heck out of side one. Side two, I don't love it as much, but I enjoy this record. I think it's a lot of fun. And you knew what they were doing. They were going a different direction. They were going a pop direction, and I think they nailed it. I think it's really good. I enjoy it. It still has a little flavor old Genesis in there at times, right? You hear it sometimes.
Yeah, Scott, I would say it's a brave record in that, again, just like they reinvented themselves earlier, they were reinventing again, right? I mean, the beautiful big fat chord progressions that I personally love from Tony, those weren't there.
Yeah.
But again, me knowing as a record producer that sometimes if there's too much stuff, nothing can be big, right? So I think Tony was probably brave in that, okay, I'm not going to hit the big chords. And that's where he starts doing single note lines, you know?
Yeah, a lot more of that.
And it allowed the drums to breathe a bit more and get bigger. And even like a song like Keep It Dark, where it's just that guitar riff almost all the way through. And then when it hits that B section and the chords do show up, it lifts it as opposed to the chords being there the whole time, right? And then as far as In the Air Tonight, I don't know, would Genesis have done that song? Would they have done it justice? It's perfect the way Phil did it.
Yeah.
And, you know, I mean, would Tony have wanted to dress it up more? You know, what I find interesting is that Please Don't Ask is on Duke.
Right.
You know, you know, In the Air Tonight certainly would have fit better on a Genesis record. I'm surprised that Phil let them take, you know, Please Don't Ask for a Genesis. That lyric is so incredibly personal that I don't think anything had been. What was the most personal lyric prior to that? It was probably Your Own Special Way.
And I think this is the exact moment where, as music fans, I think people were starting to maybe get a little confused about what was a Genesis song, what was a Phil Collins song. I don't think Tony and Mike liked that a whole bunch. But, you know, Mike was able to get a little Mike and the Mechanics action going there. So I think that helped him out a little bit. You know, Tony's solo career never really took off. He had A Curious Feeling, which was fantastic. I love it. The Fugitive came out, like in 83?
83.
And then he had a couple other like side projects that he was trying to do. Nothing really worked for Tony. And I wonder how much his lack of commercial success compared to, you know, Phil and Mike actually, you know, affected his ego and his territorialism vis-a-vis space on a Genesis record. To wit, we get Shapes, for a lot of people, their favorite pop Genesis album. It kind of does check all the boxes. It's got enough progressivisms in it that it can appeal to maybe perhaps some of the older fans. It's got hits, yet there's still an atmosphere that's unique and interesting about it. I like this record, and I know a lot of Genesis fans who really don't like Phil Collins era Genesis actually can stomach this one for whatever reason. It's got a horrible album cover, but I absolutely adore Self-Titled. I think this is a great record.
As do I. And, you know, the proof in that there was always the spirit of progressive rock there.
Yeah.
The lead single on this record.
Yeah, it's crazy, man. Mama's crazy.
Was a 6-minute song about a prostitute. Yeah. Nobody else in 1983 was doing anything that sounded like that was dealing with that topic. I think that's a great track. And that's another one where I think Tony, again, early on, he's just doing single note lines. But then when it gets heavy and he hits the big chords on the Prophet 10, that's what lifts the tune. And I do think that's a Lynn drum by that point.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure you're right. That's Lynn by that point.
Yeah.
This album definitely was the one. Abacab sold really, really well. But yeah, this was the one that took him into superstardom. I remember working in a record store all the way through the 80s, and all of a sudden the same people who were buying Madonna, Prince, and Bruce Springsteen were buying Genesis.
Genesis.
It kind of blew my mind. But, keep in mind that we had, we had Asia by this point. Yes, had done pretty good with 90125. So this was all kind of concurrent, and the commercialization of prog music was in full effect. But that didn't mean it was bad music. I mean, the 80s were just different,
Yeah, no, that's right. I remember, a lot of my friends at school who were, again, into more mainstream music than me. They would come up to me because I had the reputation in the school as, being the Genesis kid, and they'd be like, "Hey, I heard that Genesis tune," and I was certainly okay when they were referring to Mama. Little less so when they were talking on this record. "Oh, I heard that Genesis tune, Illegal Alien." That made me cringe a little bit.
Yeah.
And then certainly on a couple of the records that follow this one, there were slightly cringe moments. But I saw this tour. Loved that show that they put. This was an interesting thing where they changed the tour, the stage setup on this, where they had Tony in between the two drummers,
right,
as opposed to Tony being stage left, down stage left, where he always was. He was between the two of them, which looked amazing, but I could only imagine that's a tough neighborhood, having two loud bastards crashing cymbals all around you. I'm sure Tony didn't appreciate that.
Yeah, and we got a comment about Silver Rainbow.
I agree.
Yeah, I can't argue with that, man. What a great track. Is it a prog track? This is where at this point it just doesn't matter. It's a great song. Yeah, it's probably not prog at all, but who cares when it's that good, when that melody is that solid. I love it. Good record, but the hits weren't going to stop, man.
And another cool thing, Scott,
insane.
Silver Rainbow, and practically all the songs on this record was Tony and Mike did a lot more background vocals on that record. Yeah. Wasn't just a big stack of Phil Collins coming at you. I mean, obviously the big harmonies were definitely still Phil, but you can, like Silver Rainbow, you can hear Tony Banks's voice.
Yeah,
and
good point.
The Fugitive gave Genesis fans an opportunity to hear what Tony sounded like.
Yeah, and we'd really only heard Tony a couple times. There was that one B-side back in 1970 that finally showed up on Archives.
Yeah, the Shepherd.
And then Fugitive. He sang that the whole thing of Fugitive, but subsequent Tony Banks solo albums, or even some of those other projects, he'd like sing one song. And then he's got Fish singing the rest, or the dude from Wang Chung.
And Nick Kershaw.
Yep. What do you think about this live album? We talked about Seconds Out and the Genesis Live from '73. What do you think about Three Sides Live? I know this was two different albums, whether you were in the US or the UK. I thought this was a decent representation. I was working in the record store at the time, and guess which side I kept playing over and over? The one with the big old medley on side 3, and it just showed me that it was cool that a band that was selling millions and millions and millions of copies were still playing like Colony the Slippermen live. Come on, man, give them credit where credit's due. A fun little record. Do you like this thing?
I think it's a great sounding record.
Yeah,
and if we want to refer to the American edition, one of my all-time favorite Genesis songs, and it's a Tony one, it appears on side 4, and that's Evidence of Autumn.
Evidence of Autumn's great. And I love Paper Lake. I do like the horns. I'm not going to lie. They had a little something to Genesis. People hated it. The Earth, Wind, and Fire influence. But that to me was what prog was all about, not standing still, doing some different things, trying some different sounds. But this one here just sounded like they were going straight for the till, which they proceeded to do in a lovely way. 5 top 10 hits on this thing, man. This whole album is just one long hit, basically. I was expecting greatness, to be honest. When Shapes came out, I think a lot of people were pretty excited about it. So I was absolutely thrilled when this came out until I listened to it. And then I realized we're not going anywhere new. This one really kind of disappointed me. Retrospectively, it is what it is. It's a great collection of pop hits. But yeah, how does this one impact you, man? Invisible Touch.
Well, for me, what I remember about that record was that summer being proud that Peter Gabriel was on the charts with So, and Steve was on the chart with GTR, and Genesis was on the charts with Invisible Touch. So regardless of the quality of the material, it was cool to see all that. I love the Domino Suite on that record. Yeah, I mean, other than that,
a lot of hits, man. You got Invisible Touch, Tonight, Land of Confusion, In Too Deep. That's side one.
I know.
That's just like you got a top 40 radio station on, man. It's just insane. It's crazy. This one sold pretty good, you know, and rightly so. Why wouldn't it? It was nothing but hits. And then you throw in Domino, you know, and that gives you a little bit of something. But you're right. Some of their contemporaries were actually doing music that was a bit more interesting. You bring up, you know, singer Peter Gabriel. He was certainly doing way more interesting things at the time. And then, you know, you had issues in the band. You had all kinds of, like any band that's at the top of the mountain, man. I mean, Invisible Touch was about as big as they get.
Yeah.
The band that just was, they ruled the 80s, man. Phil Collins ruled the 80s along with Prince and Madonna and Springfield. He was the man. He was the colossus of an entire decade. And then, you know, what do we do about that? We come out with this. A big disappointment for a lot of people, a big disappointment for me. I love the sound of this record. I think it sounds amazingly great, but this was the era of the CD, and everybody felt like you had to put so much material onto an album or else, you know, fans felt cheated. I felt cheated that a lot of this material was included. I don't like this thing. Its best moments aren't great moments. No Son of Mine, Driving the Last Spike, and Fading Lights. I like those.
Yeah.
The rest I can kind of do without.
Well, you know, I tell you what, I agree with you. I think it's probably the best sounding Genesis record from a pure technical standpoint.
Yeah.
It is the best sounding Genesis record.
Yeah, I've said that for years. It's amazing.
Yeah. And again, I'm all right with No Son of Mine. And, you know, I do like, Driving the Last Spike, and I do like Fading Lights. You know, there is a tune on there that I know Phil really didn't like, was Never a Time. I like that from a romantic standpoint. It reminds me of the girl I was dating who ended up becoming my wife. So maybe my perception of it is a little bit colored from that record came out the year that I met my wife. So it will always kind of remind me of that. Yeah.
It stops at Invisible Touch, says Tom.
Well, Tom is being generous if he
That's nice.
Include that.
Yeah. Some Genesis fans,
But Scott, there are a couple of really nice B-sides from that era. Right, Feeding the Fire, I think, was from from Invisible Touch. And then there was a really nice B-side from this record, and the title is escaping me now, which again, what's that?
Our people will know it. They'll chime in. They'll let us know. But there were a couple tracks that were decent that for whatever reason, and you know, you see that time and time again from Happy the Man and Twilight Alehouse on. People, you know, can talk about what song should have been on here and what song shouldn't have been. This was just entirely too long, and I blame the age of the CD. But I love the production. I think it sounds amazing. And then, of course, we know what happens after that. Phil decides it's finally time, and he leaves the band. The big old search is on to find his replacement. A lot of names are talked about, and a lot of drummers talked about too, because he had to deal with both sides of that equation. So they ended up using two different drummers on Calling All Stations. The Israeli guy whose brother is in Blackfield, the name escapes me right now, and Nick DiVirgilio played on a couple tracks, and then the vocalist thing, I guess, came down to Ray Wilson and David Longden, I guess, were the final two names. And they went with Ray Wilson. Not saying it was the wrong choice. What I am saying is the wrong choice is that Chester Thompson and Daryl Strummer should have been named full-time members of the band. And maybe I'd feel a little different about this. If this would have been the band where, Chester and Daryl finally were in and allowed to, brainstorm with Mike and Tony on some song ideas, that could have been a really cool storyline. I could have gotten behind that a little bit. As it stands, this is a weak collection of songs. I actually feel bad for Ray Wilson because he's actually the best part of this album. I think he's dynamite on this album. I just don't think this is Tony and Mike at their best. They sound tired. They sound road worn and weary. None of these songs really resonate to me. You got any tracks on here you like?
Just one, Not About Us.
Yeah. Congo, Shipwrecked, I guess are the ones people always point to.
Yeah, Shipwreck sounds like a Mike and the Mechanics tune to me.
Yeah.
And Congo had a nice vibe, but it doesn't go anywhere as a song. It just kind of slips away. But Not About Us kind of brought the acoustic guitar back to Genesis.
Yeah.
And I agree with you. I think it was unfortunate for Ray Wilson because people who don't like that, I'm not sure it's because of Ray Wilson. I think he did all he could with some pretty weak material.
Yeah, I think he's fine on this record. I actually had no idea who he was. I didn't know Stiltskin. I never heard that song before. I guess it was a hit in certain parts of the world. Stiltskin had a big old hit. I didn't remember it. So I thought he did great. To me, the problem was the songs just weren't very good. And again, I really do believe that if I don't know about Daryl Strummer. He was and is, so tight with Phil. He probably would have stayed with Phil no matter what. But I guarantee you Chester Thompson would have said yes if he was invited to be a full-fledged member of the band. A real big missed opportunity there. And honestly, Genesis didn't make a whole lot of bad decisions. If you look from 1969 on, they made a lot of really, really good, smart business decisions outside of musical decisions. That stopped the minute Phil Collins quit the band. And Calling All Stations was a bad idea from start to finish. Should have never happened. Not Ray Wilson's fault at all. I will defend that guy. I think he's dynamite. I think he's a great singer. But yeah, if the material's not good, it's just not good, right? I mean, that's what we always say. It's about the music on top of everything else. And yes, indeed, Chester said yes to Unitopia, man. That new Unitopia album is outstanding. Brian, have you heard that thing, Seven Chambers?
I have not yet, no.
It's Alfonso Johnson and Chester Thompson is your new rhythm section in Unitopia.
Yeah.
And it's as good as it sounds, man. It's amazing.
And I saw, somebody's mentioning David Longden, and I saw an earlier comment, Kevin Gilbert. Oh, yeah. How amazing would he have been? Again, that's taking nothing away from Ray, because I think Ray did a great job. So I don't know if Dave Longden or Kevin Gilbert would have been able to make the impact. I don't know if Tony and Mike were going to be willing to let somebody new come in off the street and have that much of an influence on what they were doing. Which again, I think was a missed opportunity. But, you're absolutely right. Genesis was a well-managed band. Yeah. And the fact that they were so well-managed kept them from having to do some things that maybe Yes had to do over the years, like go out on the road, booking tours after Rick Wakeman and John Anderson had left the band and forcing poor Trevor Horn to go out and do a tour trying to emulate John Anderson, right?
Yeah. Lamb to the slaughter is all that was, man. The U.S. crowds, they were so high they didn't care. Whatever, man. I recognize this song. It's all good, man. But they get to the UK, and poor Trevor got. He's a sensitive soul, man. Let's face it. We all are. We don't want anybody booing us and throwing stuff at us. Doesn't feel good. But that's just, the pre-internet days, man. Now if you don't know who's in the band, that's on you now. Back in 1980, I'm sorry, it was on the promoter and it was on the band and it was on the labels to inform and educate people. They had a right to be angry. I felt so bad about Trevor Horn. What a great dude. What a great singer. But man.
And Drama was a good record.
Drama was a great record. Actually, retrospectively, you go back and, to me, Drama's a lot like Duke in that, at the time, I understand you were probably angry about the drum machines and, the lack of long songs and everything. But you go back and you listen to it. It's just incredible. Duke is unbelievable. Probably the one album that, and then there were three I kind of felt the same way about, man. I just didn't like it. So, that 4-man era really will always be in my heart. But those first 2 3-man Genesis albums, man, just really moved up the rankings for me. And I think that's, like you said, it's where the band started figuring out how to be a democracy. It's easier to do with 3 people, right?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
So it made sense that they became more democratic as their numbers slimmed down. Steve Hackett certainly a victim of just having too many people in the band and just not enough time on a record. Maybe, if he would have stuck around for the CD era, there would have been plenty of room on a record for your song, Stevie boy. But it worked out pretty good for him. We love Steve Hackett. But Tony Banks, man, you look in the history of great keyboard players. Everybody talks about Rick Wakeman and Keith Emerson, right? And if they add a third, they might grudgingly throw in John Lord or Tony Banks. But I don't think it should be like that because Tony Banks added so much to the vocabulary of prog music that you talk to a prog musician like yourself, I'm guessing probably took more from what Tony was doing than from what Keith or Rick were doing at the time.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. I mean, first of all, I hate those. It doesn't need to be a competition. And I know I know Tony was a big fan of Keith Emerson, and I know that Tony and Rick Wakeman are friends, so amongst themselves. But that's I will have controversial opinions. For instance, I love Rick Wakeman playing piano for David Bowie, but in Yes, I preferred Tony Kaye. Now watch the comments.
Oh people don't want to hear that kind of stuff, but the space Tony Kaye allowed Steve Howe
and Chris Squire.
That only works when you have 1970-71 Steve Howe and Chris Squire energy going, because those cats in 1970 were as good as it ever got. The fact remains is that, Steve Howe has lost a step, guys. And I hear it all the time that, Steve isn't as good a guitar player as he was back in 1970. Yeah.
None of us are.
And rain is wet. What else do you want?
Right.
So today, man, this was great fun going through the Genesis discography with Brian Coombes from Rocking Horse Music Club. Brian, I know you've met Tony Banks. What kind of dude is he? Is he a nice guy? Is he like a warm guy, or is he like kind of distant when you're working with him? What's he all about?
Absolutely not distant. Wonderful sense of humor, humility. He was just very personable, and we had some good chats about some non-music related stuff. And I thoroughly enjoyed meeting him, and that was at the farm. So it was cool to be meeting Tony on his turf.
Right. So you get a more relaxed Tony. I guess you get Tony on tour, man, he's business. He don't have time he's his eyes on the prize type of deal. Yeah. So you get Tony maybe a little more calm in his own element. So what is next for you musically? What are you working on now? What can we expect here in the near future for yourself personally and for Rocking Horse Music Club? Anything on the horizon?
Yeah, there are a couple of really, really interesting, exciting projects that are underway. I'm a, Circus Wire Dolls was inspired by some of my favorite American literature. And I'm actually doing a new project with the literary estate of an American novelist that I
Wow.
can't really go into details with right
No,
now.
but when you can come on here and make all the necessary announcements.
Because it's a beautiful marriage for me between American literature and music. And
Nice.
will be some Prague people involved in that. And then the other thing that's happening is I've had a few conversations with some theater people in London about adapting Circus of Wire Dolls into a
it's begging for something like that. Somebody's hearing the same thing I'm hearing. It's absolutely begging for. It's a very visceral album. It's also a very visual album in that it's taking you places and you're kind of visualizing the things going on. It's a really good record. I'm so glad that Kevin from Prague Radio turned me on to your music. And again, for those of you coming in late, Brian Coombes, his album last year, Circus of Wire Dolls, #1 album of 2022 on Prague Radio. Very cool stuff. Just a little bit of note keeping here. Next week, I don't know what's going on with Wayne, man. Did he die? I don't know what happened to him. I got to check my messages. He probably messaged me, but I have my phone next to me, but I never check it in the middle of a live stream. It just comes across rude, Brian. But we were planning on doing Pink Floyd tier ranking next weekend. So that'll be a lot of fun. That's November 26th. And then the weekend after that, oh, man, I'm excited to make this announcement. You guys know him. You guys love him. It's Dean Wolf, the Prague Dog. We'll be here on the Prague Corner as we break down the greatness that is Rush. Oh, you a fan, Brian? You like Rush at all?
Growing up in the Northeast, they were my biggest band.
Buddy. I love me some Rush. So that's what's going on the next couple weeks here on the Prague Corner. Next week it's Valentine's Day. Thanksgiving. I don't know. We're doing Valentine's Day in November. What are we gonna do? Thanksgiving in February. It's ridiculous. No. So it'll be kind of like a short week. I don't know what I'm doing next week at all, but I do know one episode that I'm working on. I'm gonna be looking at the top selling albums of all time, the top 25 selling albums of all time. Is there any Prague in that list? What do you think?
Would Dark Side make it? That would be the logical candidate.
There's going to be some surprises on that list because I'm looking at U.S. sales figures from the RIAA. Differs quite a bit from worldwide sales figures that we've always been told that Michael Jackson Thriller is the biggest selling album of all time. That is true in a worldwide number, but we're looking at the U.S. sales figures, so it's going to be filled with, lots of surprises and lots of fun stuff. Mm-hmm. Yeah, a little bit of Prague is on there. It's going to be a lot of fun. That's what we do, man. I did a Taylor Swift ranking last week, and man, that got me in a little bit of hot water. So you never know. Brian, this was great, man. I really appreciate you being on here. For those of you who don't know, I've only been showing it throughout this whole stream, man, but check it out. This is a fabulous record, Circus of Wire Dolls from Rocking Horse Music Club. Brian, thank you so much for joining us. Any last words, sir?
Just want to thank you, Scott. Thanks for having me. This has been a blast.
Yeah, a lot of fun, man. And I think the peeps were good. People in the peanut gallery seem to like what they saw here today. Anyway, I'm going to take it home with the obligatory, I love you guys. Peace in the Middle East. Free Tibet. And God save the king. Save King Chucky. Oh, yeah, Chucky the Third could use your saving. That son of a gun needs you. Anyway, brothers, I'll see you tomorrow. Peace.